Thank you, General. Good afternoon, all of you. I thank Indic Researchers Forum for this opportunity, and I wish you all a very happy Independence Day. So the topic given to me today is the deep state in Pakistan and terror outfits in South Asia. Now, this is a topic that's pretty well spoken about. Most people across the world today are quite aware of the kind of sponsorship that the Pakistani deep state offers, or Pakistani state offers to terror groups operating across South Asian countries, most predominantly India, Afghanistan, and Bangladesh. Um, Today, I will be revisiting this topic, but not so much in terms of the terror outfits per se, but the larger ecosystem through which the deep state has been able to fund and operate these terror outfits in South Asia. So first, what we need is a holistic diagnosis of this problem. I mean, what is this Pakistani deep state, and how does it actually come in contact with these terror groups that we know today that harm the national interests of the three countries that I mentioned, that is Afghanistan, India, and Bangladesh. Academically speaking, generally when we talk about the concept of a deep state, it is believed that a deep state is an entity of individuals or a society of individuals who are known as a state within a state, or a 10th state above a state. That is, they control the overt arms of the state, they control much of the policy making, and they also control the governments of the state as we know it, in order to sort of maintain or protect a certain vision they have for their particular state. So what is this vision, and who is this deep state in India? So when we ask this question, I think most of us would generally say that it is the Pakistan army that constitutes the deep state in Pakistan. And one of the reasons why we say that the Pakistan army is what constitutes the deep state in Pakistan is because we have seen repeated military coups in Pakistan, starting from 1953 and then 1969, then 77 and so on, until the latest being in 1999 when Pervez Musharraf came to power. So this gives us an understanding that it is for those of you who are not aware, I'm not using a PPT, I'm just talking generally, so you would have to just listen to me. Thank you for that. So yeah, going back to where I was. So the repeated occurrence of military coups with brief intervals of democratic governance, there is a tendency to believe that it is the Pakistan military which constitutes as the deep state of Pakistan. And they also overthrow these democratic governments through what we call as the doctrine of necessity. That is, they use the pretext, or they use the language of national security and something known as the idea of Pakistan. And in order to protect the idea of Pakistan, they feel it is necessary for the military to take control of the overall governance of the nation, right? So when militaries across the world take over governance, right, they have to ensure that both internal security is sorted as well as external security is sorted. And in that regard, what they do is they sometimes invent external enemies who do not exist. For instance, when they speak about the idea of Pakistan, they say that the partition is an incomplete business, and so that can only be fulfilled when Kashmir is liberated and made part of Pakistan. Similarly, they always portray India in terms of an existentialist threat that has to be taken care of, and the only entity within the Pakistani establishment that can actually ensure Pakistan's security is the Pakistan army. But we all know today that that's not the case, and the best example is what happened in 1971. Right, in 1971, we see that Bangladesh was created, but it was not as a consequence of India wanting to create a state. What exactly happened was a democratically elected government was not allowed to come to power because it represented largely the East Pakistanis, the Bengalis, who do not fit the narrative of the true idea of Pakistan or the identity of Pakistanis. And so the military that took over power to ensure that the East Pakistanis don't take over power is what led consecutively to riots and the genocide that followed, where India was forced to intervene and create Bangladesh. But here, there's something important that happens in the year 1971 and subsequently until 1979, when the Soviet-Afghan war breaks out. This is where Pakistan realizes the so-called deep state, right? It starts to expand its network. And this is where we need to understand this, because today when academics talk about deep state, we're not talking about a single entity, but how that entity manages to survive itself through establishing certain networks, or by growing its tentacles in and seeding their people into various organs of the state. So first and foremost, that is where we see the Pakistani intelligence agency, which is the Inter-Services Intelligence. To some degree, it was the Intelligence Bureau as well, but by and large, it was the ISI, which is also part of the Pakistan Army. who started to make coalitions or build alliances with certain Islamist parties, right? That also that year 1979 also coincided with certain global developments, as in we saw the Iranian Revolution, the coming of the Ayatollahs in Iran, and also there was an attack on the Holy Mecca in Saudi Arabia. So there were certain tectonic shifts happening within the Islamic world as well, and taking that into consideration, as well as the Soviet-Afghan War, and also remembering the bitter experiences of the 1971 war, uh, the deep state decided that in order for the deep state to survive, to continue its survival, they would have to use Islam as a particular shield. They would have to use Islam as a sort of pill to be injected or to be given to several other organs of the state, not themselves, because they don't want the army to be completely Islamized, because they want to be a secular force. They want, even today when you look at the Pakistani army, many of the students don't go to madrasas. They are educated in foreign universities and so on. But they wanted to ensure that the Pakistani state, the Pakistani political institutions, political parties are significantly Islamized so that they can have a control over them. So that's when they began to side with certain political parties, and also creating certain Islamist groups such as Lashkar-e-Jhangvi or Sipahi-Saiba Pakistan and so on. These were principally Sunni Muslim groups meant to target the minority Shias, because one of the reasons was if the Bengalis could create ruckus and eventually have a state of their own, the fear was that once once the Islamic State of Iran was established following the revolution, the fear was that a similar possibility is possible even in the state of Pakistan, which had a significant Shia minority. So for all these reasons, that's for the first time we actually saw that the so-called deep state, which had some linkages with the Jamaat-e-Islami, then started to make inroads and have alliances with the Jamaat Ulema Islami, which was mostly a rural group, and through them come up with all these groups, which Sunni groups, which then started to target the minority Shia groups and other groups in Pakistan who are mostly not considered Muslims at all. So that is one aspect. At the same time, they also what the deep state also did was they started to train and build alliances with certain other groups which are mostly India focused and Afghanistan focused. For the groups that are mostly India focused are what we famously know as the Jaish-e-Mohammed, as well as the Lashkar-e-Taiba and so on, who then started to have alliances with several other domestic terrorist organizations in Kashmir, as well as I wouldn't say they had an alliance with the Khalistani terrorists, but still the deep state did have some bit of they did provide some bit of support to the Khalistanis, which I'll come to shortly. So that's where we see the growing nexus between the deep state and the terrorist organizations, the South Asian terrorist organizations. But whenever we talk about a deep state, it'll be it is not complete for us to just talk about the deep state and the militant groups, right? Because the deep state thrives on a certain networking, certain system that allows these terrorist groups also to operate. And that is where we see that, like any other deep state across the world, the Pakistani ISI has seeded some of its operatives even into the Pakistani judiciary, as well as they've drawn alliances with some of the organized criminal groups, right? So if you see the kind of verdict that was given against for the killer of Daniel Pearl, or for that instance, the way in which Nawaz Sharif himself was ousted. I mean, Nawaz Sharif's, the verdict that was given to Nawaz Sharif in the case of corruption and so on, it was highly ludicrous, because the judge just said something like, this person is not being honest. No court in the world will speak in terms of honesty and so on, which is derived from the religious text, right? Courts operate on the basis of evidence, and then verdicts are delivered. So all this could happen only because the Pakistani ISI had then seeded had infiltrated all these organizations and put their best men there. Similarly, by linking themselves with the organized criminal groups, it was initially in order to draw monetary financial benefits from the illicit narcotics trade that was happening between Afghanistan, Pakistan, India to the Golden Crescent route, and subsequently the drugs were then the heroin was then sent to the Western markets. But gradually they realized that there is a larger utility with these organized criminal groups as well. I'll come to that shortly. So all this was going on till say 2001, until the 9/11 attacks happened, because this is all a South Asian matter, which the Western nations did not have to worry about much. But what happened since the 9/11 attacks is slightly more complicated. Pakistan was forced to take a serious stance with regard to the global war on terror. But somehow, under the leadership of Pervez Musharraf, they had tactfully handled the situation by handing over a few terrorists who they felt that were not critical for Pakistan's or the deep state's vision, as we know it now. But then, coming close to 2008, when the 26/11 attacks happened in India, that was there were some certain consequences which the Pakistani deep state had not anticipated. Many of the states, Europe, especially European states, who were sort of neutral when it came to when they were sort of neutral when it came to the question of terrorism in South Asia, because they always saw this as some sort of an India-Pakistan problem, right? Because what Pakistanis had always done was connected to the Kashmir problem, which was seen as an unfinished business of partition, and hence the Westerners always believed that it was a South Asian problem in which both Indians and Pakistanis were culpable, right? But the moment 26/11 attacks happened, and over 50 people who died in that attack were foreigners, mostly from the Western countries, the Europeans woke up to the reality of the Lashkar-e-Taiba, right? They started to learn about the Lashkar-e-Taiba. Western diplomats began to make efforts to know what the problem of Kashmir is, what the problem of militancy in this region is, and so on and so forth. Now, that is something that the Pakistani ISI had not anticipated. So what the ISI did at that point in time was that they came up with the fourth dimension of what we need to understand today, because the fourth dimension is the most critical dimension that we in India face today. That is, they started to see scholars into Western universities and Western think tanks, right? Most of you would not know this. Moeed Yusuf, who's the current hand, who's been the National Security Advisor of Pakistan for quite some time now, he was part of this organization called United States Institute for Peace, which was an American public-funded think tank, right? And they have ensured for a very long time, under his thanks to his participation and that of many others, that there was simply no voice coming out of the United States or these think tanks which were critical of Pakistan, right? So this is not something that the Pakistanis alone have done. All right, if you go back to 2007, 2008, when Brahma Chalani first came up with a term called "string of pearls," we saw a lot of Western scholars actually ape that terminology and use it regularly. But today you see that when China has grown into this mammoth, sort of a monster that the West is trying to fight, you don't see such kind of terminologies being used by Western scholars today, and that's precisely because of the money power that the Chinese have been wielding in some of the institutions there. So similarly, what Pakistanis have been doing is they have regularly funded all these universities and think tanks. And while these fundings have been happening, what they've also done is, as part of what the Pakistani ISI terms as a fifth generation warfare, they have made use of some of these organized criminal groups, not only domestically, but also internationally, to target dissidents, right? So this is an important aspect here, because I mean, I did my PhD in the UK, and so I've seen it from close quarters how things operate there. Many of the research work that is conducted on Pakistan, especially in the context of counterterrorism, national security, and so on, they do not happen without the approval of the Pakistani ISI, right? So when it happens through the approval of the Pakistani ISI, you know what exactly you're reading. It's a state narrative. But when the Pakistani ISI, but if you are a scholar who does not adhere to these set rules, that if you do not play by the bidding of the establishment, then the consequences are drastic. My sympathies are there with those Pakistani scholars, but they're few and far between, and there is a massive street power that the Pakistani ISI uses in the Western capitals as well. So if some of you have time, and if you would like to, if you can go on Google, you can find that there are a lot of reports of the British MI5 as well as the Metropolitan Police actually sending out warning notices to several scholars in the UK, and similarly in the US as well, that there is a serious threat, and these scholars have to report all of the movements wherever they go, right? So when we are talking about South Asian militant groups, right, we can always limit ourselves to groups like LET, JEM, and say that these attacks have happened, say the Parliament attack or the 26/11 attack, and keep talking about the same things. But then since 2014 and on, we haven't seen that many number of attacks, except for a Pulwama or a Dori attack. We haven't really, or couple more, of course, but we haven't really seen the magnitude of attacks that happened previously. So that might induce a sense of complacency in us, but where we need to stay clear is by understanding the nature of this problem. The problem is that when you talk about the deep state and its relationship with the South Asian terrorist outfits, it is not a single linkage that we're talking about. It's an entire ecosystem. So it is an ecosystem that constitutes the Pakistani judiciary. It constitutes The organized criminal groups, as I was saying, as I was talking about, it constitutes academia and influence groups globally, right? And it also constitutes the killing of dissidents abroad, which is now started. So, but what is the state of terrorism in India today? Today, we see that for most part, terrorism has come down drastically in India. State-sponsored terrorism is still continues to be a threat, but it's come down drastically. What we see today is the Pakistan establishment trying to use exactly what they use in Pakistan, that is that of street power, right? So what is happening in Kashmir today? They use drones to airdrop not massive assault rifles, but just a pistol or so on, so that there can be targeted killings of certain people, right? The idea is to use these targeted killings to then instigate a grassroots level, to mobilize people at a grassroots level. So unlike the Maoists and other groups, right, who look for a massive rebellion, they want to brainwash people into believing that this is the right ideology we have to follow, and hence we have to take the path of rebellion. This is what the Pakistani ISI is trying to do right now. All that they're trying to do is through a couple of very well orchestrated targeted killings, they want the Kashmiris to raise up themselves. Similarly, exploiting some of Indian very well-meaning political moves, such as the farm laws and so on, they are using those to make sure that some street power that can be marshaled by certain groups that support the Khalistani movement in India. So they're trying to make use of them to ensure that peace and stability is harmed in India, so that then the vacuum that is created once the law and order system collapses, that can then be exploited by militant groups or terrorist groups that then infiltrate from across the border. So we are again back to the time of 1970s and 1980s, where somewhere our own policies were sort of double-edged, though we were well-intending, but we did give sufficient gaps for inimical forces to exploit, and I see ourselves back at that stage. But the larger question that we all need to ask ourselves is, why is this kind of a diagnosis important, right? Because in the absence of this, what has been happening is, at least since 1993, when the Bombay blast had happened, Indians have been very clear that we want the world to hold Pakistan accountable for something known as state sponsorship of terrorism. And that is something that has sustained even to this day. But unfortunately, that is unlikely to yield results, because the whole concept of state-sponsored terrorism, though the description of it might be dicey, it might lie in several factors, that is direct sponsorship or indirect sponsorship, just offering certain financial assistance, or even giving territory for terrorist groups to use, and so on and so forth. But the point is, when you're trying to counter state-sponsored terrorism, the language that is generally used by countries is that of morality, is that of global norms, and so on. But when we actually look at the responses, the only driving factor is that of national interest, right? So even though across the world there is an unsaid understanding as well as an acceptance that Pakistan does qualify to be a state sponsor of terrorism, it's never going to happen. Even there are studies conducted by American researchers, which are available on the internet, who do agree that Pakistan qualifies to be a state sponsor of terrorism, even from the criteria laid down by the United States State Department too. But they also agree that, from point of view of, say, defensive realism and so on, it makes sense for the United States not to go too strong against the Pakistanis. So that gives Pakistan a very easy, it can come up with n number of solutions to overcome this problem, right? In 1993, we saw that they could convince the CIA that that this is a problem of Kashmir, it's a problem of India and Pakistan. So what the CIA did was they had taken a piece of equipment from India under the pretext of wanting to test if it was sold to Pakistan or not, and then they conveniently came back and said that it has been misplaced in the laboratory, right? And today, similarly, we can see that Pakistan is being tightened, its economy is being tightened with all the FATF verdicts and so on. But then all Pakistanis had to do was just share the location of Ayman al-Zawahiri, who doesn't contribute much to the Pakistani grand vision. So, by doing these piecemeal, through using such piecemeal tactics, right, Pakistan can overcome the problem that is posed by what we call a state-sponsored terrorism. So the solution actually lies in not emphasizing much on state-sponsored terrorism, in the sense that whenever given an opportunity at the global level, at the level of narrative, we do need to continue insisting on the concept of state-sponsored terrorism. But at the level of policy, I think that we also would benefit by describing the problem in as candid terms as possible. That is, this is not state-sponsored terrorism alone. This is clearly Pakistan's covert actions, right? The moment you say this is Pakistan's covert action, right, and this covers all the fronts that I was talking about, be it killing of dissidents, being planting of narratives that are anti-India, that are that draw false equivalence between India and Pakistan and so on. Any of this that I was talking about, they all fall under the larger umbrella of covert action. The moment it is presented in these terms, as a scholar of intelligence, I can tell you that is when you develop strong counterintelligence measures, right? Say, for example, let me give you this example of Britain. Now, the MI6 is aware of the kind of nefarious activities that Pakistan is involved in. The MI5 is also aware of it, right? But which of the two organizations has a greater incentive to fight this kind of problem? It is the MI5, because they don't want, they are the ones who are serving these notices also to some of the dissidents, right, that you're going to be threatened. Because if a single individual is killed in the British territory, it is the MI5 that has to answer. It's a failure on their part. But for the MI6, the story is different, right? Because Britain today is not the colonial power that it was. So it has to find newer routes and new avenues to exercise its influence. And one of those ways is this perverse way of maintaining points of influence, if I may use that term. So what they do is they build liaisons with many of these agencies, with many of these dissidents as well. Dissidents in the sense, when I say dissidents, not the dissidents against the Pakistani state, but many of these dissidents were required, many of these criminals were required by the state. It is no surprise that today Vijay Mallya and many of those people have chosen UK and as the destination. So when we say state-sponsored terrorism and when we talk about information sharing mechanisms, right, we are principally focusing on foreign intelligence agencies cooperating with each other. But I think that the real solution lies in calling this as a covert action and a problem of counterintelligence, where we can get the United States FBI, or where we can get the Indian Intelligence Bureau, the British MI5, and many of these local agencies to cooperate with each other, because they have a real problem to deal with, right? So even when 26/11 happened, we may talk about a couple of warnings being shared by the CIA with the RNW and so on. But the fact of the matter lies in the fact that it was a massive counterintelligence failure. It was an internal security failure. So long as these internal security organs of the entire globe can cooperate with each other to overcome this problem of terrorism, as well as subversion, I think the solution lies there. So here today, 75 years after independence, when we sit back and we reflect on this problem, I think that what we can achieve in terms of calling this problem a state-sponsored terrorism is far limited, though we should not stop those efforts. We should still continue those efforts, and those efforts will bear greater benefits if and when India gets an opportunity to be part of the permanent members of the United States Security Council and so on. But until then, I think that we'll have to consider this problem of covert action and ask ourselves, what are the likely responses that we can have? And that needs to be our own operations that are aimed to discredit all the efforts of the Pakistani deep state. So if there is a very strong Pakistani narrative that is anti-India, or that is drawing false equivalence between India and Pakistan, the question ought to be, what is India doing in that regard? What are Indian academics doing in that regard? What are Indian journalists doing in that regard? What are Indian intellectuals doing in that regard? So it should be a whole of government approach, and that can only come when there is an adequate appreciation of the problem, not just using the terminologies that the West would want us to use, while they're very clear that they're not going to do anything about it. So with that exposition, I'll stop it here. Look forward to any questions if there are. Thank you so much.